Lanctôt and the workers that he represented saw the creation of Canada as a project of their English bosses who were just trying to line their own pockets. And Lanctôt and the workers that he represented accused the Catholic priests and the conservative French-speaking politicians who were personally the creation of Canada as being the servants of English masters. So, one of Lanctaut's first acts as the president of this federation was actually to denounce Confederation in favor of Quebec becoming an independent country that was separate from the rest of Canada. Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journal podcast series. I'm your host, Dave McGrane, a professor of political science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan and member of the Perspectives Journal's editorial committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and ideas of the leaders who shaped Canadian social democracy. Some of them you might never have heard of, and some of them might be very familiar to you. Either way, their lives will show you what social democracy has contributed to Canadian history, and their ideas will provide you with lessons that you can apply to your own activism today. Since this is a podcast on Canadian social democracy, I want to start off first with a very basic question. Who was Canada's first social democrat? Well, there's no definitive answer to this question. I want to make the case today that Canada's first social democrat was someone who was very politically active in Montreal right around 1867 when Canada became a country. I'm talking about Médéric Lanctôt. Lanctaut's origin story is really fascinating. I want to dive into that before I describe his social democratic ideas that he was talking about during the time period right around when Canada became a country. It could be said that Lanctôt was born into his radicalism. When he was only 1 year old, his father took up arms against the British army that was occupying Quebec in what became known as the Rebellion des Patriotes, or the Patriots' Rebellion. This took place in 1837 and 1838. Lanctaut's father was found guilty of high treason and sent into exile in Australia for the first years of Lanctaut's life. This family trauma left a deep mark on Lanctôt, and he grew up in the shadow of his father's exile. Throughout his childhood, Lanctôt was absorbing stories of resistance and stories of French-Canadian patriotism in the face of the British oppression of Quebec. These stories must have had some effect on Lanctôt because his rebelliousness was evident at a very young age. In 1849, he was sent to the Collège de Saint-Hyacinthe. By all accounts, he was a brilliant student, but he lacked respect for authority. He ended up being involved in a number of student pranks and was even rumored to be part of the group that attempted to burn down his own college. His teachers obviously weren't impressed, and he soon quit school and started to write articles and opinion pieces for a local newspaper. In the early 1850s, he drifted away from Saint-Hyacinthe to the big city, Montreal. When he arrived in Montreal, Lanctôt faced something that would end up shaping the rest of his life. He was shocked and dumbfounded to see the extreme poverty facing Montreal's working class. He saw the families of factory workers living in small rent apartments with no running water and no electricity. Through talking to these workers, Lanctôt found out that losing your job meant being thrown out in the street, and that the children of these workers lacked basic educational opportunities. Indeed, most of the children of Montreal's working class families just assumed that they would be condemned to the same life of poverty as their parents. Given his family's radical background, Lanctôt was not the type of person who could sit idly by when he saw so much injustice all around him. The compassion that he felt toward the working class compelled him to want to do something to help them. He soon became a well-known journalist who was a thorn in the side of Montreal's rich elites. He was constantly writing about the horrible living conditions of the working class, and his newspaper stories embarrassed the municipal politicians who ran the city. In one act of civil disobedience, he broke the windows of a bookstore owned by the Catholic Church. This bookstore sold pamphlets outlining how the poverty of the working class was all part of God's plan and that the poor should just resign themselves to their fate. He ended up paying a $20 fine, a huge sum at the time, and was sentenced to 2 months of hard labor at prison. What makes Lanctôt Canada's first social democrat is his activities and ideas in the short time period between 1865 and 1870, right during that time that Canada was becoming a country in a process that was known at the time and is still known today as Confederation. As I mentioned, Lanctôt was clearly frustrated at all of the poverty that he saw around him, and he wanted to do something about it. But what was he supposed to do? There was no blueprint to follow. After all, he was Canada's first social democrat. It was here they became very inventive and started to do some things that no one in Canada had done before in his attempt to reduce the working class poverty that he saw all around him. He noticed that workers in Montreal were always electing conservative and liberal politicians into power, but there were never any candidates that represented workers. So, a long time before the NDP even existed, Lanctôt presented himself as a Labour candidate in the Montreal municipal election of 1866 in a working class district. Many workers had been impressed by Lanctaut's journalism that criticized Montreal's elites. And in a hard-fought campaign, he was elected by only 8 votes. However, Montreal's rich businessmen were not going to stand by and do nothing while some radical was elected to their city's municipal government. They contested his election in court, and a local judge ruled that Lanctôt did not have enough property to be an elected official. So his council seat was given to his opponent, who was the owner of one of Montreal's largest factories. Amazingly, Lanctôt did not give up in his fight to improve the living conditions of Montreal's working class. If the elites were not going to let him take his seat at City Hall, he decided that he was going to unite all of the unions in his city as a way to reduce the poverty of the working class. At the time, there were some unions in Montreal, but they were small and scattered all around the city. Lanctôt came up with another novel and new idea. At a mass meeting of over 5,000 workers at the beginning of 1867, Lanctôt proposed that all of Montreal's unions come together under one big federation of unions. He argued that by working together as one united force, the unions could bargain more effectively for better wages and better working conditions than if they stayed apart. After the meeting, the Grande Association de Protection des Ouvriers du Canada, loosely translated as the large association for the protection of workers in Canada, was formed. This was the first federation of unions in Canadian history, and Lanctôt becomes its first president. As president, Lanctôt wrote pamphlets identifying the root of the plight of the working class in his city as the factory owners, who were greedy and hoarding way more than their fair share of profits of the businesses that they owned. His solution was that government had to force capitalists to be more enlightened in their thinking and to be less greedy. So he proposed a law to force business owners to create schemes that would fairly share the profits of their businesses with their workers. Any capitalists who refused to equally share their profits with their workers would be subject to a very large financial penalty that they would have to pay to the government. So large, Lanctôt said, that their business would go bankrupt. Lanctaut's association of unions had some immediate successes in putting Lanctaut's ideas into action. In particular, he succeeded, along with his workers, at improving the wages at many of Montreal's bakeries. It's also important to remember that Lanctôt was a francophone and that all of the workers that he represented were francophones. But almost all the bosses of Montreal were anglophones. This situation influenced Lanctôt and the workers he represented to oppose the creation of Canada, or Confederation as it was known, when it took place in 1867. Their opposition to Confederation was very much in the radical spirit of the rebellions of 1837 and 1838, the exact rebellions that forced Lanctaut's father into exile. Lanctôt and the workers that he represented saw the creation of Canada as a project of their English bosses who were just trying to line their own pockets. And Lanctôt and the workers that he represented accused the Catholic priests and the conservative French-speaking politicians who were personally the creation of Canada as being the servants of English masters. So, one of Lanctaut's first acts as the president of this federation was actually to denounce Confederation in favor of Quebec becoming an independent country that was separate from the rest of Canada. He argued that the interests of French-speaking workers would be routinely ignored within a larger government composed of representatives of Quebec as well as representatives of the 3 English-speaking colonies that were entering into Confederation in 1867, those being Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. In this sense, Lanctôt was establishing a connection between left-wing thinking and support for the greater independence of the Quebec government to protect the interests of French workers. For Lanctôt, the equation was simple. To be on the side of the creation of Canada was to be on the side of the English bosses. To be on the side of an independent Quebec was to be on the side of French workers. At the end of the 1860s, Lanctôt was at the height of his influence in Montreal. Not only was he president of the city's powerful federation of unions, he also was introducing a number of ideas to the working class in Montreal that could definitely be considered to be social democratic. Let's quickly review those ideas. Identifying the greed of business owners as the root of the poverty of workers, denouncing the Catholic priests who preached that poverty was natural and that workers had to accept the poverty into which they were born, calling on the government to make laws to force business owners to share profits fairly and equally with their workers, running labor candidates to defeat conservative and liberal politicians who cared only about serving the interests of bosses and didn't care about the poverty of the working class, creating one big federation of unions to increase the bargaining power of workers, leading to higher wages and better working conditions. And all of these social democratic ideas were wrapped up in a French-Canadian patriotism that harkened back to the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. Indeed, for Lanctôt, it wasn't just workers versus bosses. It was French workers versus English bosses. He saw social democracy as a way to liberate Francophone workers from the dominance of the English, who had colonized Quebec for over 100 years by the time 1867 and Confederation had took place. In fact, Lanctôt saw himself as finishing what his father had begun when he first took up arms against the English army occupying Quebec during the Rebellion des Patriotes, or the Patriots' Rebellion. Taking all of this into account, it's easy to see why the impoverished worker in Montreal at the end of the 1860s was so supportive of Lanctôt and so supportive of the ideas that Lanctôt was talking about. For the first time in their lives, there was finally someone who was standing up for their rights, who represented their interests, who understood their situation. However, Lanctaut's success was quite short-lived. He was like a shooting star that lights up the sky in the night and then quickly fades away. The Federation of Montreal unions that Lanctôt founded disintegrated in the early 1870s due to infighting amongst its various member unions. Lanctôt continued to try to be elected as a Labour candidate at the municipal and federal levels in Montreal several more times, but he was always unsuccessful. He also founded a number of newspapers that espoused his social democratic ideas and critiqued the English business elites that controlled Quebec economy. But all of those newspapers went bankrupt almost as soon as they had begun. In 1872, Lanctaut's career as a politician, journalist, and union leader was essentially finished. He actually gets a bit weird and desperate at this point in his life. He goes down to the United States to try to convince the French Canadians living there to lobby the American government to annex Quebec and Canada. He thought this would finally cut Quebec and Canada's tie with the British monarchy and free Quebec from the opposition of the British. But no one wanted to hear about his ideas of the United States annexing Quebec, either in the United States or in Quebec. Quite sadly, he starts to face financial ruin and poverty. He got so poor that he accepted a job as an organizer for a conservative politician in a working class area of Montreal in the 1872 federal election. The conservative politician ended up losing anyway, and Lanctôt had to live with betraying his social democratic ideals for a paycheck. Following this sabbatical, Lanctaut's health started to falter, and he moved to a friend's farm for some rest. He died at that farm in 1877 at the young age of 38. Despite his sad demise in the 1870s and his early death, Médéric Lanctôt is an important figure in Canadian history. You have to remember that during the 1860s, it was commonly assumed that poverty was the fault of the poor. The poor were just lazy, and people thought that poverty would always really be with us because there would always be lazy people. But Lanctôt thought differently, and that's why he is so important to the history of Canada. As Canada's first social democrat, Lanctôt questioned this type of thinking, and he became one of the first politicians in Canada to actually care about the situation of the working class and to try to find ways to end working class poverty. So he is important because his life and his ideas laid the intellectual groundwork for future generations of reformers and radicals in Canada. He also teaches us something important for our social democratic activism today. Don't be afraid to be innovative. Lanctôt probably felt quite overwhelmed and hopeless when he looked at all of the poverty facing the working class in Montreal and all the forces that had lined up to keep it that way. English bosses, conservative and liberal politicians, and even the Catholic clergy. But he did not despair. He came up with innovative ideas that suited the time period that he was living in, like gathering up all of the small unions in Montreal into one big federation of unions and running Labour candidates to municipal elections. In doing so, he helped change the narratives and the discourses of Montreal politics and slowly started to reduce the poverty of Montreal's working class. He didn't succeed as much as he wanted to, and his political career was much shorter than he wanted. But others did eventually build upon what he thought and what he created. In this way, innovation is a solution for us when we as social democrats feel like the whole world is against us. And even if the innovations that we propose today seem radical and controversial, tomorrow they may become mainstream. I'm Dave McGrane, and thanks for joining me on the Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review of the Perspectives Journal podcast on your podcast platform. And share this particular podcast with someone you know who loves Canadian political history. You can also subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories that you won't find in any major newspaper. You can read more about social democracy in the Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. Get more information about the Broadbent Institute by joining our mail list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe. Come back in a couple weeks and we'll meet a social democratic leader from Ontario who started his career cracking jokes but ended up on the front lines of making political and social change at the end of the 1800s. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.